In this video, I want to answer the question, what is project scope? Project scope is in some ways the easiest thing to define in project management. But it is also in many ways the hardest thing to agree. Negotiating the scope of your project for me is right at the heart of good project management, but it's also the toughest challenge we'll face as project managers. The easiest way to define project scope is with this simple picture. Everything inside this circle represents the scope of your project. The scope of your project is everything that you have to do as a project manager, or put another way, everything that you need to deliver. Everything outside of the circle is out of scope. You don't have to do it. These are things that are either not economically viable, not needed by the organisation, or perhaps will be delivered by other projects at other times. So if everything inside the circle is in scope and everything outside the circle is out of scope, sometimes called project exclusions or exclusions from scope, what's the issue? The issue, of course, is stakeholders trying to feed additional functionality into your scope, therefore extending the scope boundaries without necessarily increasing your resources or your budget or your schedule to allow for you to deliver them. This is known as scope creep. So why is negotiating scope so difficult? Well, the answer is simple. Because you've got many stakeholders, and each of them has different preferences, different needs, different wants, different desires. They have different agendas and different interests. And the process of negotiating scope is negotiating against all of those competing pressures, trying to satisfy this person and that person at the same time, and all of this with a limitation on the resources you have available. So it's a multi-way negotiation with different stakeholders trying to negotiate and balance among their different needs and desires. And of course, with other stakeholders negotiating for additional resources or additional time in order to deliver the greater amount of scope. Consequently, you won't please everybody. Your job as a project manager is to find the best balance that you can to satisfy and smooth over the concerns of as many stakeholders as you can, and to get it signed off by those stakeholders who have the ultimate authority to decide what the final scope will be, what the final budget will be, and how long you have to deliver it. So scope is an easy concept, but negotiating it and documenting it and making it stick and winning over your stakeholders at the same time is a tremendously difficult challenge. For me, the very hardest we face. In this video, I want to survey the basics of scope management. How to manage scope on your project. There are three main areas of scope management: establishing your scope, documenting your scope, and actually managing it. So, what are the main things that fall in each? Under establishing scope, the first thing we do is we collect requirements from users and from stakeholders. And then we start to facilitate a negotiation among those users, among those stakeholders, to prioritize the requirements that they want against the resources we have available to deliver them. And finally, we produce a scope statement which defines the scope of what we're going to do and also the exclusions, an explicit statement of what we are not going to do, the areas where we are going to disappoint some of our stakeholders. Now we need to document our scope. And to do that, we build a work breakdown structure, and from our work breakdown structure, we create a WBS, a work breakdown structure dictionary. And I have a whole video on how to create a work breakdown structure for you to refer to. Next, we need to look at the acceptance criteria for each of the products or deliverables on our work breakdown structure. What are the standards they need to conform to, and what do we need to check in order to sign them off? And finally, in this arena, we need to validate the scope. We need to take all the work we've done, our work breakdown structure and WBS dictionary, and our acceptance criteria, back to our stakeholders and check that they are satisfied with them. This isn't about reopening negotiations, it's about making sure, firstly, that we've properly interpreted the outcome of those negotiations, and secondly, that there has been no material change while we have been doing this work. The final arena of scope management is controlling scope. During the delivery of the project, we need to be monitoring what's going on with respect to scope, and of course, we have to be controlling changes to scope. And change control is an important topic in itself that we've covered elsewhere. But scope management does not sit on its own. It has important interactions with every other aspect of the project. But there are some where the interactions are bigger and more evident. And the first of those is with benefits management, with building the business case and establishing the budget. Because the bigger the scope, the more the benefits, but also the bigger the budget you'll need to deliver it. Secondly, in setting the acceptance criteria, we're going to overlap deeply with the whole discipline of quality management and quality control and quality assurance, quality design processes. And finally, because we will need to change scope from time to time as events dictate, then scope management will also interact a lot with things like configuration management, version control, document management, and information management in general. And during the delivery or implementation stage of your project, there will be a number of ongoing scope management activities. Each of these is a subject in its own, but some of the main ones are resource management, making sure you allocate and deploy the resources you have, both human resources and materials and equipment, to each of the scope areas. You'll need to be constantly communicating both with your team members and with your stakeholders to make sure they understand the scope that you're delivering and how progress is going. You'll need to monitor delivery, and in thinking about acceptance, you've got the ongoing processes of quality assurance to make sure that delivery is to quality specification, and quality control to check after delivery that each product meets its criteria. Then, of course, there is change control, the process of considering and either accepting or rejecting requests for change to the scope or to the specifications. And finally, following on from the change control process, we've got configuration management and version control of all the documentation. Scope management is a core part of the project management discipline. There is a lot to it, but many people don't understand what all of the components are, so I hope I have explained them clearly for you. There are 3 words that project managers fear above all others. Could you just These words mean one thing. Someone is trying to squeeze their priorities into your project. And they want to use your budget, your resources, and your precious timeline to do it. There's a word for this. Scope creep. It's dangerous, and you need to stop it. Happily, there's a very simple 2-step process for dealing with scope creep, and we'll look at it in a moment. But before we look at how to handle scope creep, we do need to acknowledge that sometimes scope needs to change. So, afterwards, I'll discuss 2 approaches to managed scope change on a well-regulated project. But first, how do we stop scope creep? Scope creep occurs when people try to stretch the boundary of your project scope. Now, this can happen because they're opportunists,
passionate about their own priorities. Or it may happen because they simply want to take advantage of you and your project's resources. Bastards. Or possibly they just don't understand the rules. Maybe they're just plain stupid. But the reality is that more often than not, they're just a little bit confused about where the boundary lies, because the boundary between what's in scope and what's out of scope is just a little bit fuzzy. So, in our two-step process, step 1 is to define your boundary with precision. Document clearly everything that is in scope, but also document what is out of scope. Anticipate all of the could-you-justs that are likely to occur and write them down explicitly as being out of scope or exclusions from scope. When you've done this, step 2 is to get formal sign-off. Take your documentation of what is in scope and what is out of scope to your boss, to your client, to your sponsor, and say to them, look, if I deliver all of this that is in scope, and I deliver none of that which is out of scope, will you be happy? And when they say, yes, that's exactly what I want, get them to sign formally onto your scope statement so that now, when someone comes up to you and says, you can say to them, I wish I could, but I can't. Because look, I've got a signature which says I mustn't. But of course, sometimes we need to accommodate changes to scope. Let's start with managing scope the traditional, predictive way. For traditional, predictive projects, the way that we control changes to scope is with the change control process. I have a whole video on how to manage change control, and I'll put a link in the description. In essence, though, change control is about documenting and evaluating the case for every proposed change, making sure that you fully document why we should do it and what will happen if we do, and handing that documentation over to a decision maker who will make a binding decision, which you can then document. That decision is available to audit and therefore guarantees the transparency and accountability of your change process. But what do we do in agile or adaptive projects? Let's look at managing scope in the agile, adaptive way. Most agile methodologies and frameworks manage scope with a backlog. Again, I have a video on this, a video which answers the question, what is a product backlog? And I'll put a link in the description. The basic idea here is simple. A backlog is a list, usually organized by priority, of everything that any of the users might want from the project. When we plan a period of work, usually called an iteration or a sprint, then we draw requirements down from the backlog to implement during that iteration period. At any time, or possibly at specific times depending on the methodology you're using and the way you're implementing methodology, we can add or remove items from the backlog. Certainly, periodically, the team will assess the backlog to consider whether there are any new ideas, any ideas that need refining, or ideas that we should remove from the backlog because they are no longer relevant. This process is usually referred to as backlog grooming. This way, the project always has an up-to-date list of the items of scope or functionality or capability that are required and can prioritize them at each iteration. What this means is that agile projects build scope change into the process from the outset. Whatever approach you use, scope creep can be deadly for your project. It can increase your costs, It can increase your demand for resources. It can increase the time your project takes, and it can increase the risk of your project. So you need to deal with it. Happily, now you know how. Variations, scope creep, and gold plating are three similar and somewhat overlapping terms. Let's untangle them. Let's start with variations. Variations are changes to the scope, the specification, the schedule, or anything else really. The implication, however, is that they have been approved through some form of change control process. But to me, the use of the term variation suggests that these changes have been approved through some form of contractual process. When two parties to a contract agree a change, the contractual process is through a variation order, or a VO. However, sometimes someone requests a change and it works its way into the project schedule without anyone formally approving it. Yup, this is scope creep. And of particular consequence. If no one's formally approved it, this means there is no extra budget, no additional resources, no allowance in the schedule for the extra time it's going to take to create this change. This means that our ability to deliver all the things that have been approved is compromised. Scope creep puts projects at risk. When we have unapproved changes to the scope of a project, we call this scope creep. Likewise, adding extra features to your project without sanction is feature creep. Unauthorized additions to the timeline of your project is schedule creep. And unapproved additional inclusions in your budget is budget creep. I don't doubt that there are more forms of creep. Indeed, often these are simply referred to as project creep. Early in my career, I worked in the UK rail industry as a consultant. There, a lot of the people I worked with used the term the gold-plated railway. This referred to engineers' tendency to specify features and standards that exceeded the requirements of the industry. This made for better engineering, I'm sure. But it also added extra costs that were not compensated by equivalent additional benefits to the users. The term gold plating refers to adding features, services, or tolerances that the clients or users have not requested. Let's remember that quality management is part of our role as a project manager. But this doesn't just mean that we mustn't let quality slip below the defined standard. It also means that we should guard against spending additional money on quality that doesn't deliver additional benefit and hasn't been required. Any project team member that over-engineers or over-delivers against a specification is fundamentally spending someone else's money, committing somebody else's resources for a feature or a benefit that they don't want. So, if you or members of your team add features or specifications or quality to your project that your client hasn't requested, then you are exposing your client and your project to risks. Risks of schedule overrun, risks of budget overruns that you won't be able to recover from your client because they didn't specify the work, risks of setting unrealistic expectations, and fundamentally, the risk of breaching trust between you and your team and your client and theirs. Another related term is white gloving. This refers to giving special care and attention to something, often to a service. People like it when project teams offer special care and attention to the details of their precious project and to the relationships with their stakeholders. However, when that care and attention is lavished on the wrong things, at the cost of paying attention to what matters more, that's a problem. A good example of this may be overly deferential treatment of certain stakeholders. So, in summary, variations are approved changes. Scope creep is unapproved change to scope. Gold plating is adding features that nobody has asked for. And white gloving is meticulous attention to a service or an interaction. The work breakdown structure is one of the truly fundamental tools of project management. But how do you create one? If you're managing a predictive or a hybrid project of any significant scale, then there's a good chance you'll need a work breakdown structure. So in this video, we're going to look at how you create one. And we'll do it using the globally more common approach of breaking down the project into products or deliverables. And from that, identifying the activities. Now, it's worth mentioning that in the UK, where I come from, I was originally taught that a work breakdown structure broke down the work, the activities, the tasks of the project. And from that, you can determine what the products need to be and link them to the tasks. But American project managers and the Project Management Institute teach the alternative approach. Neither is better nor worse than the other, in my opinion. Both have their advantages and their adherents. But because it is the more common approach, and some would argue maybe the more rigorous approach on technical projects, we're going to break down the project into its deliverables to create a work breakdown structure and then use that to identify the tasks that need to be carried out for future planning and scheduling. So because our work breakdown structure is going to break the project into deliverables, let's start by understanding what they are. Deliverables are products or capabilities or results. For example, a thing, a process, or an event are deliverables. You could argue that a deliverable is anything tangible that you can experience. So, to create a work breakdown structure, all we need is a hierarchical decomposition of all of the deliverables. And because it's all of the deliverables, it means that if it's not on the work breakdown structure, it won't get done in your project. So it's absolutely crucial that we do it in a systematic way so we don't miss anything. Now, you'll find a lot of variance on the process that I'm going to give you, and I don't claim that my approach is any more nor less correct than any others. But what I do want to focus on is being crystal clear about the levels within a work breakdown structure. So, at the top of our work breakdown structure, we have level 0. This is the product, deliverable, or project that we are going to create through the project. It is the totality of the entire deliverable set and therefore the project itself. Level 1 is what I am going to call the key line, and this is not a commonly used term. The key line is our organizing principle for the work breakdown structure. It sets up the categories by which we're going to decompose our deliverables. Now, sometimes the key line is nothing more complex than a few deliverables, the biggest deliverables of all. In other circumstances, it may be the stages or phases of the project. It may be work streams that are thematic in nature, like technology, people, and processes. Or it could even be a geographic set of divisions. However, once you set up the principle against which you're going to decompose the entire project, that gives you level 1, your key line, and therefore sets out the titles for the major work streams for your project. At level 2, we have the major deliverables that sit within each element of the key line. Not all of these deliverables need to be an end deliverable. An end deliverable is something you want. It is there because that is what the project has been created to build. End deliverables are often defined by the goal and the objectives of the project. The alternative is interim deliverables, and you may see some at level 2, but they are more likely to appear at level 3. But while we're at level 2, the key here is to use expertise, the experts on your project team, to identify the major end deliverables and the major interim deliverables. So at level 3, we will see components of the major deliverables, and we will see a large number of interim deliverables. Interim deliverables are things we need to create in the project in order to help us get to the end deliverables. Typically, they include things like prototypes and tests. They include project management artifacts like plans and stakeholder lists. They include things like test scripts and maybe even components that we don't need, but that will find their way into the end deliverables. So to create level 3, we need to brainstorm the sub-deliverables and the interim deliverables for each of the items at level 2. Remember, because if it's not on the work breakdown structure, it won't get done. Be sure to include project management process deliverables, the artifact of project management. And one way to do that, of course, and my preference, is to set up a project management heading at the key line level. That way, you can decompose your approach to project management into a number of major and then sub-deliverables at levels 2 and 3. Remember, everything in this workstream will, of course, be an interim deliverable by definition, because it's not something we want as an end product. It is something we need to create along the way. If you do create this project level workstream at the key line, typical names would be project management or project integration. Level 4 and maybe levels below this further decompose the sub-deliverables and the interim deliverables into smaller and smaller deliverables to the point where each deliverable is a unique and fully constrained thing in itself. Make sure that these are structured into logical hierarchies and, as far as possible, sequenced in a logical order. And of course, it may not look tidy, but it is okay to go to different depths, different numbers of levels at different parts of the work breakdown structure, because your work breakdown structure should be determined by the work that needs to be done, not by some platonic ideal of a perfect, neat work breakdown structure. The next thing to do is to document your work breakdown structure. We start by creating a work breakdown structure index. We number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on across the key line. Then, starting with the first element, we look at the sub-deliverables on line 2, and we number them 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and so on. Every item on your work breakdown structure will have an index number in that format. And that format should look very familiar to you, because it is very easy to create a work breakdown structure using a simple word processing package like Word or Pages. You have a number of ways that you can present this. You can present it as a hierarchical list, or as a tree diagram, which is commonly presented as, particularly in a training context, but for a large project is rarely practical. Or you can create a work breakdown structure dictionary, a WBS dictionary, which lists every product with its reference number, but now you can add additional information. You can add descriptions, standards, specifications, resources, costs, durations, and anything else that is relevant to you to create your work breakdown structure dictionary. The final step is to present your work breakdown structure to your project sponsor, to your client, to your boss, to your steering group, and indeed to your stakeholders. Get their feedback on it and refine it before producing your final version. Your completed work breakdown structure is now a full and formal statement of the complete scope of your project. Before we turn our deliverable-based work breakdown structure into an activity tool that we can use for planning and scheduling, let's look at some good practices in creating your work breakdown structure. First, make sure the labels of each item in your work breakdown structure provide a clear and unambiguous description of what that deliverable is. Secondly, apply the MEIS principle. Is your work breakdown structure mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive? What do we mean by mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive? By mutually exclusive, we mean there are no overlaps, that the same deliverable doesn't appear twice or more times in different parts of the work breakdown structure. And by collectively exhaustive, we mean that any deliverable at a level can be completely specified by all the sub-deliverables below it. That is to say that the entire work breakdown structure does indeed represent the complete project and everything you need, both your end deliverables, the components of the end deliverables, and your interim deliverables. Now, it's worth noting that on many modern projects where they are moving from a purely predictive to a more hybrid style of project management, it isn't always going to be appropriate to try to complete the work breakdown structure at the start of the project. The project may evolve and you may need to add elements or indeed delete elements from your work breakdown structure as you go through the project, discover new requirements, learn more about the project you're doing. So whilst I grew up in a predictive environment where we would create a full work breakdown structure before moving out of the planning phase into delivery, that isn't necessarily going to be your approach in every project. Now you've got your deliverable-based work breakdown structure, how do you understand the tasks, the activities it takes to create your project? The first step is to create work packages, to identify deliverables or groups of deliverables that need to be created together, and set up work packages that collectively develop those deliverables. Typically, you will have one work package create one deliverable, but that won't always be the case. And also, typically you'll allocate the task of creating this work package decomposition to your workstream leaders who understand the tasks and the deliverables within their workstream better than you do. Once they've created the work packages, they will decompose those into the individual activities that need to be done. These can be then arranged into logical sequences and you can estimate time and resources against them and indeed budget for them. And that's the third step. Planning is about taking the sequence of activities that you identified, taking the estimates of how much work it takes to deliver them and the duration of those activities and putting them into a schedule and building a budget. So from a work breakdown structure, you can determine the dependencies, estimate durations, allocate resources into those tasks, and therefore estimate costs. So now I hope you can see why I describe the work breakdown structure as a fundamental project management tool. It's the tool that opens up the way and connects with so many other project management artifacts. The work breakdown structure is a scoping and scope management tool. It's a planning tool. It's a resource allocation and resource management tool. It's also the basis for detailed risk identification, and it's therefore a tool for governance. And because of that, it becomes a communication tool and a tool to help you with reporting on project status and progress. It can also, by attaching specifications to the work breakdown structure dictionary, be a quality management tool. And finally, very often it is the basis for integrating all of the other project management tools.
In this video, I want to answer the question, what is change control? Shift happens, things change. And I know that the ideal, particularly in traditional project management, is that we nail down the scope and we seal up the specifications of a project at the early stages, and then we deliver it and nothing changes, and that makes life very easy. But it isn't ideal because the environment in which we're operating is constantly shifting. New technology becomes available, the market shifts, and there are new commercial pressures, there are new opportunities. Politics means that there's new legislation, new regulation. Society changes during the course of long projects, and consequently, it would be absurd if we fixed every aspect of our project during the planning stage and then we stuck to it rigorously. Change control therefore provides us with a process to control the necessary changes that happen during the lifetime of a project. Now, of course, what happens on a project typically is that things are going well, and you know they're going well because that's when someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, Mike, everything's going great. The only thing is I've changed our minds." Now, as a project manager, your first instinct is almost certainly to say, "Oh, it's fine, just leave it with me, I'll sort it out. Just do it." But of course, the problem with that is, where's the budget coming from for the extra work? Where's the time in the schedule going to come from? Where are you going to get the resources from? And what about all the additional risk? Perhaps it's safer to say, well, no, we can't do that. We've signed off our definition, we've signed off our plan, our specifications. We can't change anything. But of course, as we've seen, sometimes you need to. So what do we need? We need the one thing that project managers crave above all else. We need control. And a change control process is what gives us that control. And it's a very simple process. And it starts with that question. Change my mind, want to do something different. And your answer to that isn't yes and it isn't no, it's thank you. And then you ask the person who's come up with the idea for change to document the two things they are best suited, best able to document. Firstly, what precisely is the change that they're asking for? Because you can't do anything until you know what it is they want. And secondly, what are the reasons why they believe this change is right? Is there a compelling, necessary reason to make the change, or is there a compelling advantage and benefit in making the change? Now, once they've done that, you can take that clear articulation of what the change is, and you can then work out, what are the financial implications? What are the schedule implications? What are the resource implications? What are the risks that arise from it? And how does this impact other things that you know are going on outside of your project? And when you've got all the reasons why you should change, and all the implications of change in terms of budget and schedule, risk and impacts, then you can take them to your decision makers and they can make an informed decision. And that's either going to be to accept the change or to reject the change. The only reason why they might defer a decision is because they believe that you haven't provided them with all the information they need to make a decision, in which case you have failed to a degree in your job. So if they decide to accept it, your stakeholder is happy because they've got what they want, and you're happy because you've got the extra budget, you've got the extra time in the schedule, you've got acceptance of the risk, you've got access to the resources you need, you've done the planning, it's just a job. If, on the other hand, the decision is no, it's too risky, there's not enough benefit, or whatever, then that's it, I'm afraid. The stakeholder who asks for the change is going to be, I am sure, disappointed. And many change control processes actually have a stage within them where the stakeholder can advocate in person to a board or a design authority group that makes the decision. They may be disappointed, but at least they know that this isn't you, the project manager, being capricious. There's been a robust process and it's auditable. But that's it. No change. Now, when there is a change to be made, or whether there isn't a change to be made, every request goes into a change log, which details the request that's made, the timings, the people concerned, the decision, and the implications for the budget and the schedule and anything else. And that change log creates your audit trail of all the changes and the decisions that are made, who made those decisions, and where we can find the evidence on which they based their decisions.
You know your project is going really well. When a stakeholder comes up to you and says, "We're very pleased with how this project is going. The only thing is, we've changed our minds." This is a job for project change control. Shift happens. Things change. So, no matter how much you want to nail down the scope and the objective and the design and the specification and the functionality of your project from day one, you can't. All you can expect is to get a good articulation that will need to change as you work through the project. Because if your project is to stay relevant, it needs to respond to changes in requirements, to changes in the marketplace, to changes in technology, to changes in society. But the problem with changes is that they can create project chaos. And as one stakeholder after another requests this change and that change and this change and that change, it can be really hard to keep up. And for you, as a project manager, it can be tempting to say either, yeah, of course, no problem, we'll sort it, or no, we can't. The scope is fixed. Or maybe you'll just pretend not to hear. A blanket yes, a blanket no, or ignoring your stakeholders is not sustainable. But you can't have that chaos. And what you need is to exert control. What you need is transparency and good governance. You need a process, a change control process, which puts all of these requests for change under your control. And let's face it, if you have a contract, let's not even think about the consequences of not having control over the changes. And while I think of it, when you have a contract, then what I'm going to be calling a change request later in this video, you will more often call a variation order, or a contract variation order, CVO. So let's get going. What is change control? Project change control is a process. It starts with a request for change, a stakeholder asking for a change to the scope, to the functionality, to the specification, to the detail of what you are doing or producing on your project. Your change control process will capture that request formally, assess it rapidly to understand it, and then carry out a full and detailed evaluation. It will review the options and make a decision, implement the changes required, and then track the implementation of those changes and learn from the process. To learn more about how that process works, I have a dedicated video and I'll put a link to it in the description, rather than burden this video with too much information. In my free glossary, Be on the Inside, Decode the Jargon of Project Management, I define change control as the process of managing requests for change to make sure decisions are made accountably. The requests are documented on a change request form, and all requests are logged and tracked on a change log. It ensures that where changes are authorized, appropriate additional resources are allocated. In that definition, I named two artifacts of change control. The two artifacts of project change control. These are your change request document and your change log. So let's look at them one at a time. And by the way, I have templates for both of them in our project templates kit. And yes, you guessed it, there'll be a link in the description. Change request document. The whole process starts when someone suggests or requests a change to functionality, specification, capabilities, or some other aspect of your project. This is known as a change request or as a request for change, or RFC. Your response to this is neither yes nor no. It's thank you. Then you will ask them to document what their request is. Firstly, the details of the change they're requesting, and secondly, why they are making this request. What are the benefits of those changes or the compelling drivers that mean we need to make those changes? They'll do this on a project change request document, which may be a simple paper template, or it may be part of an online project management system. and you'll find an example template in our project templates kit. Typically, it will have 3 parts. Part 1 is the proposal. What precisely is the change requested, and what are the reasons why it's being requested, the benefits or the drivers. Part 2 is the review. This is where the project management team will assess the implications of the change being requested. How much work will it take? What resources will it require? How much will it cost? What delay will it incur in the existing project? What additional risks will it create? And what will be the impact on other activities either within or outside of your project? All of this is designed to give the information that the decision makers need to make a robust decision. So the third part of your change request template will be for the decision. This is where the decision maker, which may be an individual or a board or a committee or a steering group of some form, will document their decision, which is going to be to either accept or reject the request for change. And typically, I would expect somewhere, for the sake of the audit trail, the decision maker to sign off on that decision. Once the change request form goes in, the process has started, and I'll remind you that we have a video on that you can watch if you need to. But to keep track of all of this, the second artifact that we need is our change log. The change log. This is a document of record and a management tool. It's a key part of governance, but it also helps you manage the process. And it keeps a record that justifies every increase in expenditure, every deployment of additional resources, every additional delay to the schedule. You may be using a sophisticated project management system with the change control process built in, but if you're not, the ideal simple tool to use for this is a spreadsheet. And yes, we have a changelog spreadsheet as part of our project management templates kit. To end the video, I'd like to address some wrinkles specifically around change control in big, small, and agile projects. So, what if you do have a small project? Good judgment is the key to all project management. The bigger, the more complex, the riskier, the higher profile your project is, then the more robust your processes need to be. However, if your project is small and simple and low profile and low risk, then you can keep your change control process really simple and possibly even contemplate doing away with it altogether. Let's face it, in some projects, you can pretty much plan out everything and expect very little change along the way. It's a short project and people understand it. In short, never let your urge to follow some standard process override the value of doing something sensible. So what if it is a big, complex project with lots of change? I have managed a large project with a lot of change that had a full-time staff managing the change control process, 3 senior experts and an administrative team to support them. And the decision process was made by a dedicated decision-making group that met 3 times a week. This was a highly structured process that was an important part not just of the governance of the project, but frankly of delivering something of real value. If you need to do something similar and you want some terminology, you could consider having a change control team and a design authority group, a group of senior experts who can review each change request and make an informed decision. But what if we're using agile project management? Because let's face it, agile project management is designed to get away from the need to have change control, because we do everything in short iterations or sprints. We draw down just the few elements of our product backlog to work on that we know are most needed in the next time box period. So, in principle, agile projects don't need to deal with change control. We never lock down the scope, and we identify what scope we need and what functionality we need at each start to a new iteration. However, Principle 2 of the 12 Agile Principles states that the Agile Manifesto welcomes changing requirements, even late in the development. Agile processes should harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. Different Agile frameworks each have their own approach, and it is beyond the scope of this simple introduction to look at each of those. If you are doing Agile project management, then understand the interaction between product backlog and the need for change control. However, if you're managing your project either as a predictive project or as a hybrid project, then you will need to think in advance about the right change control process for your project. When people want to change the scope, functionality or specification of your project, what do? Do you roll over and say yes to everything? Or do you assert yourself and say no, confidently and firmly? Of course not. You need to make a rational decision every time. And that means a process, a change control process. It needs to be rigorous, transparent, and accountable. But how does it work? Project change control is a process. It starts with a request for a change in scope or functionality or capability or specification. The process will then capture the request formally, assess it rapidly, carry out a full evaluation, review the options and make a decision, implement the changes, and track those changes and learn from the process. That's the 6-step process that I'll be describing in this video, but please do note that many of the formal approaches to project management, as documented in things like the PMI's Guide to the Project Management Body of Knowledge, or the APM's Body of Knowledge, or the Prince 2 manual, Managing Successful Projects with Prince 2, do not include what I've described as steps 5 and 6. They don't consider anything after the decision as part of the change control process. However, I disagree. What kind of process is it if we fail to implement the changes that we agree and we don't review what's happened and what we've learned from it? So, step 1 is a request for change. The change control process starts when someone makes a suggestion or a request for a change. This is known as a change request or a request for change, or an RFC. Whatever you call it, your first response is simple. You thank them for their suggestion or their request, and you take note of it. You'll need a simple change request form to document their request. And the most important questions to ask them are, what precisely is the change you're suggesting or recommending or requesting? And why? What are the drivers that make this change necessary, or the potential benefits that make it desirable? A change request form is likely to be structured into 3 parts. Part 1 is the proposal. This documents the change requested and the reasons. Part 2 is the review, which documents our assessment of the implications of those changes, which we'll talk about more at stage 3. The third part is for the decision. This is where the decision maker or the decision makers will record their decision, either to support and uphold the request or to reject it, and, importantly, their reasons. And it's usually accompanied by some form of endorsement in the form of a signature. Step 2. Change control rapid assessment. Not all change control processes will have this step, but to me, it makes sense for the project manager to conduct a rapid assessment of the change request. There are 2 things that I would typically consider at this step. And the first is my familiarity with the change requested. has this request been made before? If it's new, then I can move on. If it sounds familiar, if it's the same as or similar to one that's already been requested, has a decision already been made? If so, I'll let the requester know, and I probably won't need to take any further action. If the change request is still in progress, then does it make sense to combine the existing change request with this new one? Does this new one add anything to it, or does it modify it in any way that is material that I need to take into account? The second thing to consider is the scale of the change requested. In some contexts, the project manager will have the authority to deal with minor change requests on their own, to evaluate them and to make their decision. This will usually be based on their seniority within the organisation. So ask the question, does this change request have either a nil or a small impact on the schedule, the budget, the resources, the risk, or the quality of the project? If so, it's likely that you as project manager will be able to make a decision with minimal formality. It doesn't, however, mean that you shouldn't be recording the change request and your decision. Step 3, change request evaluation. The bulk of your work will come at this step. Work with your team to document the implications of the change requested for things like the project schedule, the budget, the resources you will need, the risk profile of your project, and on the implications for other things that are going on around your project. This evaluation will allow you to complete the second part of the change request form. This means you'll be able to present the decision maker, which may be an individual or it may be a change control board of some form, with a balanced argument, a mini business case, which sets the benefits or the drivers for the change against all of the implications of that change, which are likely to be increases in the budget, the resource requirements, maybe even the risk profile, and the time it will take to deliver your project. Step 4, formal review. Your project decision makers need to assess the case that you have put forward, and based on the evidence, they can make one of 3 possible determinations. Firstly, they can choose to accept the request for change because the case is compelling. The benefits outweigh the costs and the risks. Second, they can choose to reject the request for change because the case is not compelling. The benefits do not outweigh the costs or the risks or the delays. The third option is to defer their decision. However, to my mind, there can be only one reason for deferral, and that is because they do not have enough information to make a definitive judgment. Which raises the question, why would that happen? Why would they not have enough information? And that, my friend, is down to you as the project manager. It's your job to provide all of the information they are likely to need and to get to know their information requirements, because the implication of a deferral is that it is likely to increase the cost and possibly the resource requirements and the risk of making the change. A decision maker or a change control board of any kind needs to know that it must not defer any decision unless it cannot reasonably make that decision. Step 5, change implementation. Now it's time for you and your project team to implement the change that has been accepted. Now, the good news is that you've already calculated the impacts on budgets and schedules and resourcing, which means you have a plan. So really, it's just work. Step 6, track the changes that are being made and learn from the process. As with all good project management, you need to monitor and control what is being done and learn from the changes that you make. When the changes are complete, learn from the outcomes What was the impact of the changes? How did the process work? And how effective was the decision making? And at the end of the process, complete the other document which I haven't yet mentioned, the changelog. A changelog or a change register is a simple document, or maybe a software tool, which tracks and documents the process. It is an important part of your project audit trail, which is vital for good governance and transparency and accountability. A changelog is also an important management tool for you as project manager. And I provide templates for both a changelog and a change request form in my project management templates pack. And I'll put a link in the description. So my change control process has 6 steps, and they are easy to follow. But it is important to do it right, because accountability for change is vital to avoid scope creep. Please do give this video a like if you've enjoyed it or learned from it. I'll be making loads more great project management videos for you, so please do subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of them. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.